Oops.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for Series 3 of the webinar training, Forms Creation and Tips. Joining us today is Eric Nilsson. Eric is a certified Marketo expert. He has worked with dozens of Marketo customers to help optimize their Marketo programs. Eric provides unmatched marketing automation expertise with hands-on instruction and actionable best practices to transform your marketing organization into a demand generation machine. Eric works with Show Me Leads, a marketing automations consulting company. As a technology services provider at Show Me Leads, we craft powerful marketing automation solutions and ensure long-term success for our clients. We do this by customizing and deploying the Marketo platform, generating and nurturing quality leads, ensuring long-term success in lead qualification efforts, and crafting powerful marketing automation to help grow your revenue. Our selection of programs and services address a wide range of problems clients experience, so we can tailor solutions to your unique needs. Whether it's becoming an extension of your marketing team, creating custom email templates, performing health check audits, and assisting with training or integration needs, we help optimize your Marketo instance. Now, before we get started, we want to encourage everyone to submit questions during the webinar. We'll go ahead and answer these questions at the end during the Q&A portion of the webinar. And with that, we can go ahead and get started. Eric, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thanks, Courtney. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session around form creation and tips. Just as a quick recap, back before the holiday, we covered email programs and data management. Today, we have form creation and tips. Next week, at the same time, we will be doing email creation and tips, and then the following Thursday, we'll be doing how to create engagement programs. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for our future sessions as well, and our past sessions are available for view in terms of the recordings. So let's get into form creation and tips. So let's start out, we're going to start out kind of generally, and then we're going to move into some more specific, maybe very basic training ideas with some larger concepts around them. So if you're experienced with forms, a little bit of this may be repetitive to what you know already, but then we'll take it another step and hopefully provide some good insights for you. So why use Marketo Forms on Marketo landing pages? Well, there's a few things, right? We're going to minimize duplication. Marketo Forms do not create duplicate leads. If Joe at abc.com is already a lead and Joe fills out a form with the same email address, that lead will not be created, it will be updated. So doing that is a very wise thing, so you don't get a lot of duplicates in your data. And dating back to my last webinar on data management, we want to make sure we have good data. Advanced nurturing, hidden fields. Hidden fields are great. One, it allows you to put a value in a form that is based on various different factors. It can be based on the page itself. It can be based on the page it came from. You could put UTM parameters into a form and save it under the hidden fields. So you can get a lot of good stuff in there. They're easy to modify and produce. Marketo Forms, to me, are quite easy. Compared to, this is what they call Forms 2.0 at Marketo. About 2 years ago, maybe 3 now, they put this in. The original version of Forms in Marketo was very difficult to use, not very robust. This took it a whole other level and really made things a lot easier. And the other thing is pre-population. If I've visited your website before, in that, let's say I use the same browser all the time or the same machine, I'm cookied. And so if I visit your page again and visit a form on your page, it's going to know who I am, and it's going to pre-fill in any data that it already knows. So if it's first name, last name, email address, it remembers that from the last time you filled out a form and pre-populates it through pre-fill. This is a real great feature of using it on a Marketo landing page. We will talk about this a little bit later when we talk about embedding on non-Marketo pages. But the short version of that is that pre-fill does not work when you're embedding forms on a non-Marketo page, you'd have to do some advanced coding to make that happen. It's not native. So that is kind of a high-level overview. We also want to kind of go a little bit further, some concepts that we're going to talk about. One is reusing forms on many landing pages. So there's two ways to go about it, right? You may have a specific campaign or offer or something like that where you need to get specific information. Maybe it's a product interest. It could be a number of things, right? And you need a form specifically for that event. And you create that, you put it on a landing page that's specifically for that event, and everything's good to go. But oftentimes, if you have, for example, let's say, as an example, gated content. Maybe you have 10 pages that have gated content, and you pretty much want to collect the same information on all those pages. Well, you can create one form that collects that information and put that form on multiple different pages that then take them to what they want to see. This is, sometimes it's just a matter of first name, last name, email address on a form so that they get emailed a PDF of some white paper, whatever the case may be. We talked a little bit earlier about duplicates. So forms do prevent duplicates, which is a great thing because there are some ways to get duplicates into Marketo. It's very difficult to clean duplicates out of Marketo, so you want to try to avoid that as much as possible. A recommendation: keep them short and sweet, right? We don't want to have, if possible, 15 fields on a form to fill out. One thing that helps with this is progressive profiling. I won't go too much into that now because at the very end of the webinar, we're going to cover that. But we do want to try to keep them short if possible. And we talked about collecting data within hidden fields as well. So, again, hidden fields really add a lot where they don't necessarily know they're providing the information that they're providing. So we talked about short forms. Ask for only what you need, right? These are some stats that we found here at Show Me Leads that kind of go with what we see in a form. What you see is the more fields you have, the lower your conversion rate and the higher your cost per. You'll notice too that all these fields are marked as required, which really then makes it even less likely to get converted to a lead. Just think of it from your own perspective. You've gone to a website, you want more information, they want you to fill out a form and it's got 10 fields on it. Well, at least for myself, if I go to a page like that, the last thing I'm going to do is fill out that form. It's just too much, unless I really, really, really want it. But if you ask me for a few fields, 3, 5, 6, I may be more likely to do that. It's a matter of effort, and a lot of people don't want to put that effort into it unless they really want to see it. So keep using short forms, right? We definitely want to do that. Higher conversion rates and get more information over time, which again we'll get into when we get to progressive profiling. So these are some high-level concepts that I wanted to go over before we get into the details. Again, we're going to partially treat this as training, so there will be some very low-level basic training involved for people that may not have ever used a form, and then we'll go into the higher-level advanced concepts of each of those. So here's the topics we're going to cover. We're going to talk about creating a form, form theme, adding fields, edit field labels, making fields required, setting a thank you page, previewing a form, embedding a form on your website, making a field hidden, and we're going to talk about progressive profiling. So creating a form, right? We've potentially done this already, right? You're in a program, you go new local asset, and you select form and give it a name. It's kind of how you do everything within Marketo, right? When you're working in a program. But I do want to say this, right? This set of instructions going into a program, selecting new local asset, this is perfect for the situation where you have a form specific to your program or specific to your campaign. You want that form to live within that program because it's specifically targeted at that campaign. So from an organizational perspective and just keeping your tree on the left-hand side clean and healthy. If you're going to reuse forms, if you have a generic form that you're going to use on 10, 20 different pages, you're going to want to create this form in Design Studio rather than in marketing activities. Design Studio is a great place to use to create reusable content. I would recommend it for landing pages as well, emails, anything that you're going to reuse from an asset perspective. So while I'm showing you this here, because if you do have a specific form for a specific purpose, it's great to keep it organized under that program. Definitely keep in mind that from an organizational standpoint, if you want to reuse a form, putting it in a program is not going to be the way to go, because you're going to have 10 other programs that want to use that form. Unless you have within that program multiple landing pages that are all going to use that form. So again, if it's being used specifically for that program, put it in the program. If it's going to be reused or used by multiple programs, put it in Design Studio. So let's go back to this, and we'll go to themes. So selecting a theme is pretty simple as well. You go into form settings once you've created it, and you can toggle back and forth, left and right, between different form themes. So it gives you different looks and feels, how checkboxes and radio buttons and things like that are going to look. It's really kind of a nice way to keep your forms consistent. If you don't like the default theme, you can mess around and try different themes to see what looks best for you. What I generally see is people use the default theme. This is probably a highly underused feature in Marketo Forms, but I do think that it's worth taking a look at the other themes, seeing what they look like, and see if it makes sense for your particular use. So let's talk about actually creating the forms and adding fields to a form, right? So again, at the base level, right, you're going to go into the field details and you're going to click that plus sign. That plus sign allows you to add a new field to the form. You'll notice, by the way, that first name, last name, and email address are already in the form. The form assumes that you want this information when you create a new form, and it'll put that in there automatically. You can certainly remove them if for some reason you don't want them, but definitely will be there by default. So if you want to add a field, you hit that plus button like I mentioned, and you start typing in the name of the field, and you can select that, put it in, add another one, and keep adding as long as you want. Again, hopefully keeping it short. Generally speaking, at the very minimum, you want these three: first name, last name, email address. Email address is a must. Why have a lead in Marketo that doesn't have an email address when the main purpose of Marketo is to send emails? I've seen people do it, and it boggles the mind a little bit. First name, last name, definitely important. It's interesting though. I have seen customers here that in a B2C environment that want first name, and they don't really care if they get last name. They just want to know if your name's Bob, Joe, John, whatever. That's a business decision that they've made. It's fairly rare, but I have seen that happen, and it's not necessarily wrong. You want to at least have some name information, I would think. But again, at the minimum, you want an email address. So let's talk a little bit about labels. So when you add a new field, as we were showing, it's going to put in the name of the field into the label. In most cases, the name of the field is not going to be necessarily what you want to display, right? First name, last name, email address, definitely. But for example, in this one here in the screenshot, the field name is num employees. And so the label would come up, num employees, and we definitely don't want to see that. So instead, we're going to type into the label number of employees by clicking on the label and filling out the form at the right-hand side. Be careful with labels. We don't want them to be too big to where it just takes over the form. I've seen situations where they have first name, last name, email address, and then they'll put a field in there that takes up 3 lines just to show a label. And suddenly that field, while still taking in just say normal text, becomes this huge label. It goes out of line with everything else because now it has to have a bigger gap between fields. It's just really ugly. So, here we have 2 lines. I would keep it to at least 2 lines, or to no more than 2 lines, I should say. Be very wary of the look and feel here and the user experience. And that actually is going to be kind of an overarching theme today, is user experience. We want to make sure that the user is having a good experience in filling out the form, or else they're not going to do it. And we don't want that to happen. Another interesting thing is if you start to get a form that, if you must have a longer form, you're going to want to column that form potentially, right? There are cases, I've seen it, where you want 7 or 8 fields collected, and you do one long vertical form, and it fits into your page just perfectly, and that's fine. But in some cases, you don't want a long form because it seems longer. and I say that because it's interesting, the behavior of people who fill out these forms. If you give them 10 fields vertically, it seems like a lot. But if you give them 5 fields on the left and 5 fields on the right, the form feels shorter to a lot of users. And it's really a strange behavior. But it's true. It doesn't seem as bad because it doesn't seem to take up as much space. And it looks like something I might want to fill out as opposed to this really long one. Again, like anything else, it's your call. But definitely, it's going to matter on how it fits in your page too, right? So if you can make it fit with 2 columns, great. But sometimes you're more worried about the content. You want the form to be over on the right-hand side as a extra, and you want a long form. That's fine too. So, while I would suggest not having a long form in the first place, if you do need to have one, put it over there. Another thing, and we're going to get into required fields here in a second. In fact, that'll be next. One thing about required fields, to the extent you can avoid fields being required, it definitely will improve conversion rates. So we talk about keeping forms short and the conversion percentage that you get from keeping forms short. Another way to improve the conversion, if you want to have, say, 10 fields on the form, but you only make 5 of them required, suddenly I don't have to do as much work as the user. And I'm maybe more willing to fill in the stuff that I have to fill in, and I'll just leave the rest blank. While you didn't get all the information you wanted, you got the key information that you really needed, and you got that person to fill out a form and become a lead. And really, that's the important thing, right? We want leads, and we want valid, good leads. If it's really important that you get a field, mark it required. That's fine. Generally speaking, at the very minimum, email address has got to be required. This goes back to my statement earlier. What's the use of having a lead with no email address? Generally speaking, what we usually see is email address, first name and last name being required, and then sometimes maybe company. If the customer is going to expect some kind of sales follow-up, you can require phone number. Just beware that, and this is something that came up in our last webinar on data management, be aware that when people fill out a form, they're not necessarily going to be truthful. And if you, let's say, have gated content and they have to fill out a form to get to that content, they may put whatever they want into that email address or to that company name or first name, last name. I've seen some creative things go into email addresses before that are very interesting. So keep that in mind. This can happen with any form. So certainly, don't take that the wrong way, because any form, 3 fields, whether it's gated or not, I can put whatever I want into that form. But Gated content can kind of drive that a little bit because you're requiring them to become a lead just to download a document, for example. So how do you make a form field required? It's very simple. You highlight the field in Marketo and you check the box that is required, and that's really it. It's very simple to do, but again, put a lot of thought into that. Like I was saying earlier, if you've got a 10 field form and they're all required, you're gonna get a really poor conversion rate. That's just the bottom line. It's not something that people are going to want to do. So next, let's talk about thank you pages. And first, we'll really quickly run you through how to do it. You're going to go to form settings like we did earlier. And then you're going to tell it basically how we're going to follow up. There's 3 ways to do that for thank you pages. And all of them have their benefits and non-benefits or problems. 1, stay on the page. So you fill out the form, click submit, and the form submits and you stay on that page. Fine to do it. Problem is sometimes people don't realize that they've filled out the form. They don't think it worked because they're still on the same page. Clearly hitting submit, because duplication doesn't happen with forms. If they keep hitting submit, it's fine, but they're never going to know whether or not their lead got in or not, whether or not you got their information. So the one thing you can do in some cases, and this is more of an advanced topic that we're not going to get into today, but there is a way to put an alternative bit of information into the space where the form would be once it's submitted. So if the form has been submitted before, instead of seeing the form, you'll see something like, thank you for giving us your information, thank you for your interest, things like that. That's more of an advanced topic, but it basically replaces the form. And if they come back to that form or that page 3 days later, they're still going to see that because they've already filled out the form. So that's one thing to deal with on stay on page, but it's fairly rare. And again, you can do a little bit of harm if you don't do that advanced feature I was just talking about. You can go to an external URL. So they fill out the form and I want to take them to my home page now, right? They're on a Marketo landing page. They filled out the form. Now go to www.mycompany.com. Sometimes you want them to go to the page that actually contains your gated content and it exists on your website. So you'll take them there. That's a little more common than stay on page. Definitely nothing wrong with that. And strongly encourage that that's where the content lives. And then very similarly, you can take them to a Marketo landing page. Very similar idea to the external URL. You're basically taking them to another page with the information that they have filled out the form to get, or at the very least, it says thank you for filling out your form. You obviously want to thank a person for filling out the form. It's kind of basic courtesy in marketing, so we're not going to explain that too much. But once you create the thank you page, you basically just go in here and put in in this case, the external URL. If it's a Marketo page, you'll have a drop down of the various different landing pages that are existing in Marketo, and you'll be able to pull that information down. Let's talk quickly about previewing a form. This is something that maybe is a little underused. So a lot of times what people do is they'll create the form, throw it in a landing page, and then see what it looks like. And that's a step you don't need to do right away. And you can actually preview the form within the form UI itself by simply going to the form, go to Form Actions, and hit Preview. And you can see what your form is going to look like before you even put it in a landing page. This is, again, it's a preference more than anything, but it saves you the step of having to create a landing page, particularly if you're going to embed that page on a non-Marketo page, if you're going to embed it on your website. This is the way to see what your form is going to look like before you go and put that embed code into your website. So from a testing perspective, I would definitely recommend doing it this way. Again, it's personal preference. It's not a huge problem if you don't, but it's just a nice way to be able to see what your form looks like without having to go through extra steps. And speaking of putting your form on a website, we'll talk a little bit here about embedding your form onto a non-Marketo page. So I have a lot of customers that want to basically have a form on one of their pages, on their website. And they don't want to go through the landing page process because they've got this whole structure on their website to go from one asset to another, or from one page to an asset, or whatever the case may be. So instead, they want to put the form in their own website. So it's easy to do. Let's start off with that, right? You go under Form Actions, and you can basically hit Embed Code. What this does is this brings up a piece of code that you can copy and paste into your website page. It's a piece of script. You put it in there, and that's all you really have to do. Certainly you have to test. Certainly you have potential issues because this is JavaScript, you may have some interaction with other JavaScript on your page where they conflict. So there is some troubleshooting that may have to happen when you do it. But once it's on there, it's basically the same thing as if you had it on a Marketo page, with one large exception: prefill. We talked a little bit about this earlier. Prefill does not happen on a form that's not on a Marketo landing page. So if I've already filled out your form and I go to it again, it's not going to remember that my name is John Doe at all. I'm going to have to fill in that information again. And if I happen to put in a different email address, it's going to create a new lead for me. If I happen to put Jonathan instead of John, it's going to update that in the database. It's not going to remember anything from a past visit. There's certainly ways around that through custom coding that you can do some API calls that will basically pull the information from Marketo of their first name, last name, and email address, for example, and pre-fill that in for you. But natively, it will not. So just keep that in mind from a user experience perspective. If it's on a Marketo landing page, pre-fill works as long as you have pre-fill turned on. It does not work natively on a non-Marketo landing page. We talked a little bit earlier about hidden fields. I wanted to just kind of walk you through really quickly how to do that. It's an interesting way. It's not like a checkbox like you might expect. It's actually a field type. So instead of text, it's hidden, for example, which it gets a little confusing sometimes for some people because they expect just a checkbox that says hide this field, and that doesn't exist. Hiding the field is something that allows you to collect more information, like we talked about earlier. But where do you use that, right? Well, one, let's say you have a singular form for a singular program, and you want to pass to Marketo the fact that they got to this form via a certain program, where you can put the name of the program or some kind of code or something into that hidden field. It'll store in Marketo, and the user never knows anything about it. I talked a little bit about UTM parameters earlier. There are ways, and it's a little bit more of an advanced discussion that we're not going to go into the details of today, but you can have UTM parameters in your web address. And if you're not familiar with UTM parameters, if you've ever seen a web address that then has a question mark at the end and some value equals another value, those are UTM parameters. And it can pull the value out of that UTM parameter into a hidden field, and when they submit it, it'll send that information to Marketo, and they're none the wiser. There's multiple different reasons to hide a field. Basically, you want to collect information without the user necessarily knowing that you're collecting the information. It's something that's fun to play with. Go in, see what kind of stuff you can do. But again, that's kind of the reasoning behind potentially doing that. Now to the, as I want to call it, the star of the show, progressive profiling. Progressive profiling is, one, incredibly important for conversion if you're going to want to collect a lot of information. Two, it's not that hard to do now. It's actually quite easy. The difficult part about progressive profiling is more about figuring out how you want to do it and what you want to do. The technical part of it is not hard. Let's go into our first slide. Keeping the form short, again, like we talked about. You can present new fields each time and progressively fill out the profile of the visitor. You want to make sure that pre-fill is enabled for visible fields and disabled for hidden fields. So you want to make sure that you don't have pre-fill in something that you're progressively profiling. All you do is you go into progressive profiling, I should say, in settings, set it to enabled, and you're all set to go. So what do? Well, you get a box down there at the bottom. It says progressive profiling. Anything inside this box is part of the progressive profiling batch. Anything outside the box is going to show up in the form every time. So in this case, where we moved country into the box, you're going to see first name, last name, email address, phone number, and mobile phone number every time. But country and other fields will be progressively profiled. Anything outside the box will always appear. So here we've got a little more clean example. We've got 3 fields in, 3 fields out. But then what do? Right? Well, it's, again, very simple. You tell Marketo how many blank fields you want to show. So, we talked about having, we're going to go back to this slide. We talked about having pre-fill turned off on these progressive profiled fields. And over here, when you set it, you're going to set it, in this case, to 1. So what does that mean, right? What's going to happen? Well, if we go back here, let's say this was set to 1. The first time I visit, first name, last name, email address, and phone number are going to show up. That's going to be my form. The next time I go in, I'm going to see a form that's slightly different. I'm going to see first name, last name, email address. Those will be pre-filled if I've visited before. But now mobile phone number will show up, and phone number will not be there at all. It has my phone number. It's not blank anymore, so it won't show up. It goes to the first field that's blank. Similarly, the third time I come, it'll be country, and so on and so forth. If my number is set to 2 or 3, I've seen forms that had like 15 fields on it, and progressively profiling those so that it's a form that they expect people to keep coming back to, and you just keep gathering more and more information, but you're only really asking for 5 at a time or 4 at a time or whatever the case may be. So definitely a valuable way to collect information, and will help you with your conversion rates to keep forms short. Let's go back here. Making fields required in the progressive profiling box is strongly discouraged. Little typo there in the box, but making fields required is definitely something that you don't want to do for those that are in the box. Why? Well, if you want a field, if they're not visible, they're left blank, and you may have a form that's unable to be submitted because they are required. It's also just logically a little odd. If you really need that field, why is it in progressive profiling in the first place? It should be outside the box because you really need it. If you really want company, don't put it in the box, keep it in the form, and that way you get company filled in that first time. So you really want it, make it required. So progressive profiling, again, keeps your form short, can potentially gather you a lot of information in a short form over time. And that's really the benefit that you're going to get from progressive profiling. It is underused, in my opinion, from what I've seen with customers. It really, I think some people are scared of it, to be perfectly honest. It seems like an advanced concept. It's very easy to do. The advanced concepts are all around how you want to implement it. What fields do you need? What fields don't you need? what fields can you wait for? All of that sort of thing is more conceptual, is more information that you have to decide as a marketer. But technically speaking, it's a very simple thing to do. So don't be afraid of it. Try it. Do some test forms on a test landing page. See how it works. Fill it out. Come back, fill it out again. See the kind of information you get on a test lead, and you'll really see the value of it. So if you take nothing else away from today, definitely give a shot to progressive profiling. It's incredibly valuable. So that was the not only the start of the show, but the end of the presentation. Let's talk really quickly about upcoming sessions. Since this is a webinar series, we have 2 more. Next week, I didn't change the dates on here. Next week on the 18th will be email creation and tips. And on the 25th will be how to create engagement programs. So ignore those dates that you see there. It's the next 2 weeks on Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, each Thursday. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Courtney and see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, you shared some really great information and examples on form creation in Marketo. We will go ahead and open it up for questions now. So if you haven't already submitted your questions, please do so now in the questions box, and we'll get to those as soon as we can. So we do have a lot already. The first question we have is from Michael. Are there any standards for how many fields to progressive profiling?
Yeah, good question. I always hate to answer a question with "it depends," but it depends. So the issue there is, how fast you need the information and what feels comfortable. If you have a short form already, maybe it's email address, phone, first name, last name, having 2 or 3 progressively profiled fields at a time still keeps your form pretty short. If you are outside of that progressive profiling box pulling in 5, 6 fields, I might keep it to 1, maybe 2 max. So it really depends on the size of your form outside that box before you make that decision. I would never go more than 3. I think that's the max. You can definitely do more if you want, but if you go more than 3, it's kind of a feeling of why bother progressively profiling in the first place. So I hope that answers the question, but it does depending on what your goal is.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So the next question we have is from Scott. Can you share some pros and cons for using forms on non-Marketo pages versus Marketo pages?
Good question. Well, for me, and we talked about this a little bit, pre-fill is the biggest difference. Being able to do it on Marketo landing pages, not being able to do it on non-Marketo pages. I think that's a huge difference, and it's something that you need to weigh when you make that decision. Benefits obviously are you have pages already and you just want to put a form on a page you already have. Maybe you have web developers who can develop pages more efficiently on your website than they could within Marketo because they're not necessarily trained on Marketo yet. Downside, again, is pre-fill, but also if you're the one who's doing it, you obviously, as a marketer, will be more familiar with the landing pages in Marketo maybe, and so it just makes it easier for you to do it without having to depend on somebody else. So really, another it depends answer, but there's good and bad for both, and it really just depends on your situation, your needs, and what you have already in place.
Thanks. So the next question is from Amy. How do you recommend testing forms?
Okay, so let's see. We talked about using preview of a form for look and feel, but testing the form itself is a different story. So there's 2 ways to go about it, and it depends on whether or not you're embedding it on a Marketo page or not. What I typically do, even if I am embedding it on a non-Marketo page, is I put the form first into a Marketo page, just into a basic page, nothing fancy, not necessarily any design. First thing I want to know is it submitting? Is it giving me the information I want? and is, for example, is progressive profiling working properly, that sort of thing. Create a generic landing page, put the form on it, and start submitting, right? It's very straightforward. Where you get into a little complication is if you want to do it on a non-Marketo page. In that case, initial testing definitely still I would do on a Marketo page, just to make sure the form's submitting and everything, make sure it looks right. On the non-Marketo page, I would, you embed the form on that page. Preferably that page is not live yet. It's still in some sort of in some sort of test area within your website. And you do the same thing in that website, because just because it works in Marketo on a Marketo landing page doesn't mean it's going to work in a non-Marketo page, particularly with what I was talking about earlier in terms of any kind of JavaScript conflicts that may be going on. Because embedded embedded forms function off of JavaScript, if there is a conflict between two pieces of code in the page, the form may appear, but it might not submit, or it might not submit correctly. Required fields may not work correctly. You're going to want to test all of that, regardless of required fields, progressive profiling, all of that sort of thing. But you're going to have a little more to test, just to make extra sure when it comes to non-Marketo pages. I hope that answers the question. It's really very much just think about what the user's going to do and do everything that they're going to do, just as you would with any kind of testing.
Great, thanks. So the last question we have comes from Steven. What are the recommendations for fields that should be required, and how many to have required?
Well, that is one thing I was talking about a little bit earlier. The overarching theme we talk about is keeping forms short, right? And part of the feeling of a short form is not having to fill out every field on the form. Just in your own situation, know what you absolutely have to have. Beyond first name, last name, and email address. What information do you absolutely have to collect from this form that's having this purpose, right? If it's gated content, you might only need first name, last name, and email address. If it's absolutely crucial to your business that you know what the company name is, make it required. Try not to have a 10-field form with 10 required fields. That will scare a lot of people away. So there's not necessarily a number that I would give. I think 4 or 5 would be something that I wouldn't recommend anything more than that. But certainly, again, it's a question of what you want your user to experience, and it kind of comes back to that again. And think about it, and I think I mentioned this once before, but I want to emphasize it. Think about it if you were filling out the form. If you were trying to get to this content, or you wanted to see this page, and you had to fill out the form to do it, what would you be willing to do to get to it? And what would seem like it was too much? Put yourself in the shoes of the person who's filling out the form, and that will enlighten you probably more than anything.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we have time for just about one more question. Are there any issues doing progressive profiling with forms that are embedded into a web page?
It should work the same as always. I think the only thing you're going to have to worry about is the whole thing with JavaScript conflicts and whether or not it impacts the progressive profiling. But it is not something that is specifically non-functional when it comes to embedding code. So definitely can do that. What the code is doing is basically calling to Marketo and saying, give me the form. That's basically what that JavaScript code is doing. It's contacting Marketo and saying, I need form X, please give it to me. Marketo's saying, okay, here's form X, and we'll bring it over. The one problem that you run into, though, is that there's no prefill. So you can do it, but you're going to have problems. And that's because if there's no prefill, it's going to consider a field blank no matter what. Right? If it doesn't know what it is, then it's going to have some issues. So play around with it. It really, I hate to say this, but it really depends. I've seen problems with it. I've seen it work perfectly. Um, it takes a little bit more effort to get it to work in that situation, but it definitely can work. I hate to give that kind of answer, but it's a great question. It can work. I've seen it not work. And that's because of either conflicts in the scripting or issues with prefill. But it kind of depends on how you structure it. So we could get into a very long conversation about how to properly structure that, but we don't really have time to go that far. But there are some recommendations out there, and definitely look at the community, the Marketo community. There may be some solutions there. I'm sure there are some solutions on how to properly do progressive profiling in a Marketo form on a non-Marketo page.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we are headed to the end of the hour, so we'll go ahead and wrap up at this time. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions or you want to request a health check, please feel free to contact us at info@showmeleads.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to sharing more with you the next time.
Thanks, Courtney.